Welcome to the Online for Authors podcast. I'm the founder, Jennifer Palmer. Today I'm pleased to welcome Teri M Brown as our guest host. Teri is an author herself and is considering if a podcast of her own is a fit for her. Until then, we're happy to have her with us. Teri's guest today has many years of experience as a journalist, music and film producer, and entrepreneur. Rob has founded a number of companies both in Japan and the US and has held executive positions in others. He's produced numerous films and music projects with international teams. His area of expertise include the entertainment industry in Asia and the US and Europe, and his projects often have a special emphasis on music, film, online business development, developing musical artists' careers. In addition, he has been reporting for Billboard magazine on Asia since 2007. Rob is one of the producers of Onetopia, a benefit music festival slated for 2024. And he is the son and editor of his father's new book on aging titled The Wisdom of Morrie.
All right, today on Online for Authors, I'm excited to have Rob Schwartz. He is the editor of a book called The Wisdom of Morrie, Living and Aging Creatively and Joyfully. This is a book that was written by his father, Morrie Schwartz, and Rob found the manuscript later after his father passed. Welcome to the show, Rob.
Thank you so much.
Tell our listeners, what is The Wisdom of Morrie?
This is a book my father wrote about aging, as the subtitle says, creatively and joyfully. He approaches it both from sort of a psychological aspect, which is his academic training, though this is not an academic book, and he approaches it from a really practical aspect, giving people really everyday tips and strategic ideas to incorporate into their life.
So he began writing the book in the late 1980s, right?
That's correct.
You rediscovered the book sometime in the early 2000s, and the book came out earlier this year. So kind of tell us the journey of this manuscript that took, it sounds to me like, 30, 40 years to get to the making.
Exactly. Yes, exactly. Yeah, there's a lot of side stops along the way for this manuscript. So we should start actually when my father was writing this book, when I was much younger. I was just in my 20s. And I was an adventurous spirit. I had been traveling around Asia, and I came back to the United States, to Boston, where my parents lived, and I stayed at home. It was actually the last time that I ever lived at home with my parents. And it was right when my father was writing this book. So I actually had a chance to talk to him about it, hear his ideas. He was eager to have a soundboard. Despite the fact that I was much younger, he wanted to talk about it and see, how the ideas resonated with me. So I had a lot of experience with him writing the book and the ideas in the book. Then I went off to Japan, and I started living in Japan in the early 90s. Then, of course, my father got ill with ALS, as is well known. He did a series of TV interviews. Mitch Albom rediscovered him and wrote the famous book, Tuesdays with Morrie, after my father had passed away from ALS. And that became a gigantic bestseller, as most of your listeners will probably know. And then, some years after that, 7 or 8 years after that, I was in Boston. I'm a journalist. I was writing some of my journalistic pieces, sitting at my dad's desk in the study in our house that my mother and father had lived in for many years. And I opened up a desk drawer, and there was this manuscript that, of course, I was familiar with. It wasn't like I was baffled. I was like, oh, yes, I remember Dad writing this. I also, of course, immediately understood, because of Tuesdays with Morrie, we actually had a chance to publish this now. As you say, it took a really long time, and there was many things involved in that, including negotiating and working with my mother. And I write an essay about my mother's contribution to my father's writing overall, not just this book, but overall, because they were in the same field. My father has a lot of celebrated academic work, which my mother actually contributed to, which is not necessarily as well known as he is. Yeah, it took a long time to bring it to fruition.
When you got the manuscript, at the point that you see it and you take a look at it, how complete was it?
Thank you so much for asking that question, because a lot of people have misconstrued, like, I put this together from my father's notebooks or from conversations that I had with him, which is completely incorrect. This was 100% a complete manuscript.
Okay.
From the forward till the last chapter. I had to do a lot of editing, and we can talk about that, how and why I edited it. But it was an absolutely complete manuscript. And my father had, worked on it and had it typed. He actually didn't type himself. So he had it typed up. He paid a typist, and it was even bound in a very heavy, like, black cardboard cover. It wasn't like it's just loose papers or anything.
Mhm.
So I really had a full book in front of me
Wonderful.
that he had written. Right. And it took a lot of editing and a lot of different work. And the form that it's in now is, of course, different. I think I made it much more readable. But yeah, we had a complete manuscript to work with. So it wasn't like I had any, doubt that this was something that in a form that my father would have wanted.
What kinds of things were you having to do to take your father's work and get it to what it is today?
There's two main points in that. The one is the length of time. People always think, wow, it took you this long to do it. I lost my father in 1995. He and I were very, very close, which we can talk about. It actually took me a very long time to even properly start grieving for him. And this is something that he discusses in Tuesdays with Morrie, the whole process of grief and grieving. So editing this manuscript was also involved with my grieving for him. So that's one of the reasons why it took a really, really long time. In terms of the actual editing, I will let people know that my father was an academic and he wasn't the most concise writer, right? Things just tended to drag on too long, and I had to do a lot of editing. I had to cut a lot of stuff down. I added practically nothing. Like, all of the words are my dad's. I mean, maybe one word here and there, or changing one word, but essentially all of the words are his. But I had to cut a lot of things down, take a lot of stuff out, and, just make it more readable.
You say your dad, apparently he liked to talk. Was the original manuscript maybe a little more like what you would have expected in a college classroom to hear more of a lecture? Was it more written that way? Or did he just have many more examples and many more questions than he has now?
Yeah, more the latter. Many
Yeah.
more examples, many more questions. The sentences were too long. This is not an academic book at all. My father
Right.
was an academic and he wrote a lot of academic books. This is absolutely not an academic book written in plain English with a lot of personal stories from my father. But in addition to that, I mean, this is so not an academic work that my father uses lots of other people's stories. He talked to lots of people. He interviewed people. There's lots of stories of people, seniors, people who are aging, and very inspiring stories. He drops in all sorts of different types of writing because he doesn't want it to be like a narrative or a college lecture, even if it's non-academic. There's poetry, there's newspaper articles, there's different stories, there's different voices. He has little personal asides of his life. And it's really unusual that way. I mean, it's rare to find a book that drops in all kinds of different types of writing that's not an academic work, that's not, some kind of essay on something that's pointedly, trying to educate you in some way. This is a real personal work that's trying to share his experience and his thoughts on aging.
I really understand you lost your dad and now you're dealing with his work and how that can affect you. So I'm an author and I write fiction, historical fiction usually, but I'm dabbling in a lot of different things. And I was writing a manuscript that I was about 75% done when my father passed away. And although this had nothing to do with him at all, every time I go back to that manuscript, I cannot get any further than I was it's like I get a stupor of thought, and so I've decided that I haven't grieved enough yet, that when I come to that, I get there and immediately I'm just back to my dad becoming ill. And so I understand that. And that does take a lot to be able to, recognize that you have the grieving process that you have to go through, and then still wanting to put your dad's work forward. So I can definitely understand the time that took.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
The most important point of the editing was to maintain my father's voice.
Exactly.
And, my father's voice is really present through this book. And obviously, it's his book. I didn't want to change that at all. I wanted to try and enhance it. So that was my primary task. And, I hope I've accomplished that. But I also really understand what you say, whether it's a work of fiction, our emotions, are so strong, and we have such, what's the word? We're placed in a situation where those emotions are going to be attached, whether it's writing a book or something else. They're always going to be there. I mean, I'm sure that you can work through the grieving process, however long it takes you, but those emotions may always be attached to that work of fiction.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah, and I think that's the way we are as humans. We attach to whatever was going on, and that's why things like smell and taste and those kinds of things have such strong emotions to it. So like I said, I can really understand that the editing process, it was probably both wonderful and very sad, depending on which parts you were reading or what memory you had. I'm sure there were times where it was like, I remember talking to Dad about that, and you probably really felt great, and other times where it was more like, and I really miss not being able to talk to Dad like that. And it's
that's correct. And the book made him very present for me, because it's filled with ideas. He's also very personal. Like, he has a lot of stories about himself in there. And actually, there's even a couple of stories about me. So I was actually surprised when I started editing it to read that, because, I was a young man when he wrote this book. But obviously, he's using it as an example of something else. Yeah.
Right. Well, I loved your dad's suggestion in the intro to look at all the issues, talk about them, write down your thoughts, and that the point of the book was to discover more about yourself. And he offers so many questions to ask yourself on every topic for moving forward or moving beyond whatever little place that you might be stuck in. Was that typical of your dad's style for maybe teaching or other things, to do a lot of question asking so that people would have to kind of search and find their own answers and solutions?
Introspect. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I write 2 essays in this book. One is about my dad and one is about my mom. The one at the beginning of the book is about my dad. The one at the end of the book is more or less about my mom. So yes, my father not only was an academic, and he was a sociologist and a social psychologist, very much involved with trying to, discover what is this, human psyche that we have, and how do we relate to other people? How do we relate to ourselves? In addition to that, he was actually a therapist. As I write in the book, he started a low-cost, or was a co-founder of a low-cost mental health collective or personal growth collective in Cambridge, Massachusetts, long before this was fashionable, and also addressing the idea that psychiatrists or psychologists just cost too much. This was long before insurance covered those things.
Right.
He offered this service for nothing, literally, for people who couldn't afford it. He was very attuned to trying to help people discover things about themselves. And that's part of this book. This book is also him offering suggestions, as I said, ideas that could help you age or remain vibrant and creative, or if you get stuck. And, there's very pointed parts where we all have the same pitfalls, right? Whether it's despair or regret or depression, these are the things that are going to bring us down. He addresses them head on, right? There's no point. The first thing that all psychologists will tell you, or all therapists will tell you, is there's no point ignoring those issues, because they're not going to go away and it's not going to get better. So he addresses those things head on and offers advice and suggestions and way to think about it. But as you say, The book is very introspective. It asks the reader to ask questions of themselves and find out what works for them. That's the key.
Given the number of questions, and I can see this book being used almost as a discussion group kind of, like in a retirement home, or in a, not even just for older people, but for those who work with older people, to understand what's going on with them. Have you considered a companion workbook or anything that people might be able to have next to them to use with this book? As I was reading it, I found that sometimes I was almost overwhelmed by the amount of introspection, and it was I've got to get this book read, and I need to actually be living in this book for a while. And so it would have, I felt the need to take notes.
Absolutely. So it's funny you should say that. Yes, we have thought about a workbook. It's something that I've discussed with my publisher. We haven't moved forward on it right now, but it's definitely a good idea and something that we've thought about. I would also suggest people read this book exactly in the way that you're talking about. Take notes and mark passages, have little stick-its or whatever, mark passages, fold pages, go back to them. It's not the kind of book that you just read from cover to cover and then put it down, right? You read a part, you think about it, you mull it over, maybe read a little bit more, go back to that passage. There is poetry and stories that you can read over and over. So it's the kind of book, as you say, either you live with, or you take your time and you can go back and forth. And, certain things may speak to you and certain things may not speak to you. And that's perfectly fine,
The other thing that's interesting is that I think that it's a kind of book that you'd want to keep on your shelf, because just because a particular issue wasn't speaking to you the first time you read it doesn't mean that it won't be speaking to you 3 years later when something different has happened, or there's been a change or a shift in how maybe you're doing physically, or how you're doing mentally, or how, whether you've had maybe the death of someone close to you or something. A different section of that book will address those feelings that you're having.
That's right. I think my father addresses that in general, how our feelings shift and how our perspective shifts. And it's important to embrace that. Sometimes some people, not everybody, feel, oh, I must remain constant and have the same, ideas and same opinions all the time. And, that's not necessary. Life is about growth and change. And that's what's stressed in this book, and learning. In fact, learning is one of the techniques, if you like, that my father really stresses. Sometimes when people reach a certain age, they think all right, that's it. I don't need to learn anymore. I don't need to explore new things. And my father says, exactly the opposite. When you reach a certain age, it's important for you to focus on exploring and experiencing new things and opening yourself up to new experiences, and see which resonate with you. If it doesn't resonate or you don't enjoy it, then obviously don't pursue it. Find something else. But this is one of the things that, he was concerned with. I'll give you a little bit more background. The reason why my dad was motivated to write this book is that, as we talked about, he was a professor at Brandeis University, and he was always surrounded by undergraduates. He was an extremely popular professor because his courses dealt with things like, what does it mean to live in this society, and how do we interact with the society? How do we interact with other people? He taught a course called Group Process, which addressed these questions. So, they're fun questions to talk about. Right. He was an extremely popular professor, and he always thought of himself as very young and very vivacious. He was always full of energy. I mean, literally, people said when he passed away, they were in shock, even after they knew he was ill, because he seemed ageless. And it's really true. He was the kind of person that didn't seem to have any age. And when he turned 70, his university forced him to retire. This is no longer a thing at universities. Professors are no longer forced to retire at age 70, but he was. And it was a shock to him because he viewed himself as a young person. And he had to come to terms with the fact that the university and society at large viewed him as an elderly person. And he wasn't comfortable with that at first. And he had to ask himself, why am I not comfortable with that? And of course, he discovered a whole set of attitudes that he had internalized that he thought were wrong. And those are ageist attitudes, that old people can't do anything. And he thought, well, that's ridiculous. In fact, not only can, senior people do a lot of things, they're more situated to do interesting things than other people because they have so much life experience. So he felt he had to address this in writing. And that's the impetus to write this book.
Right. And I love the fact that the book came about because he recognized, that he actually was aging, and that someone else had recognized that and kind of forced it on him. And that he recognized that he had those ageist attitudes towards other people, not toward himself, but toward other old people, what he considered old senior people. And he didn't want to be that person. And then he had to kind of change that idea. One of the things that he says was that he was hoping that people in society were going to change how they looked at seniors and those who were growing older. And of course, he wrote that, in the 80s. And so here we are now, 35, 40 years later. Do you think that society has changed much in the way that it views seniors? And do you think your dad would be satisfied with where society is looking at that question?
I'm going to say that society has not changed that much, and that it's still a major issue. We've addressed some of the big prejudices, not that they don't still exist, but we've addressed them. And, pretty much across the board, whatever your political affiliation is and however you perceive it, we all agree, or almost all of us agree, that racism is wrong, right? How do you perceive racism? And people perceive it in different ways in our society, but that's fine. We don't need to talk about it. It's wrong to judge somebody by the color of their skin, right? It's wrong to judge somebody by their gender, right? It's just wrong. You don't know anything about them just because they're X gender or Y gender or Z or whatever, right? You don't know anything about them. It's wrong to judge somebody on such superficial things as those. It's wrong to judge somebody on their age. It's just wrong. It doesn't tell you anything about who they are, the nature of their character, etc. But I think that we still have a very deep problem in this society. And believe me, it is worse in this society than other societies. There's other societies where elderly people are more venerated than this society. I lived in Japan for many, many years, and that is the case in Japan. I wouldn't say it's perfect. I wouldn't say that they don't have their issues, even regarding the elderly, but it's better than in the United States. I can tell you that. So I think this is still a deep problem in our society, and I think my father would be distressed in how little this problem has been addressed. And I hope that he would hope, and I would hope, that this book, starts a discussion or goes a little bit of the way in addressing this problem. I would add one thing, that I do think it is a little better now than when my father wrote this book and before that, in that senior people are feeling like they can exert themselves, they can do more in society. You hear about so many people who are elderly doing something fascinating, starting a second career. This isn't directly related to this book, but I do have to say it because I'm of a certain age. The society that we live in some ways, is so much different in terms of what you can accomplish than 30 or 40 years ago, especially economically. I mean, the younger generations, Gen Z and Gen Y, know all this. I mean, you can start a company and be a multi-billion-dollar company in a few weeks. That was never possible before the internet, before digital technology. It just didn't happen. So there is all kinds of possibilities, both economic and just in general, because of the internet, that you can learn about things, you can achieve things in a short period of time now. And that's extremely exciting.
Yes, it is. I agree. So I'm 60. My husband is 72. And I have noticed several times with my husband, it's been maybe 3 years ago, he had a doctor's appointment for an issue. And when he came home from the doctor's appointment and I asked about it, it had not been addressed. essentially he was told, I've seen worse. And that really made me angry because the issue was keeping him from, he's a cyclist, and it was keeping him from riding his bicycle. And he was told, well, if it hurts when you ride your bicycle, don't. And I thought, that's ageism. And I marched right back to the doctor with him. And my husband is a very, he normally will speak his mind, but I think there's something about that doctor-patient relationship. And I just, I pretty much laid it on the line and said, telling my husband, who rides 70 miles a day, 5 days a week, that he shouldn't be on his bicycle doesn't make any sense. And they said, oh, well, most people his age don't want the surgery. And I said, yes, but you didn't even ask him.
Yeah.
You didn't give him the option. And of course he did have the surgery and he was fine and he went back to riding. And so, sometimes when I'm reading things like this, I think that I know the book was intended for people who are aging, but I really think that it would be helpful for people who deal with an aging population.
Absolutely.
To understand that simply because someone's older doesn't mean that their life is over, that they don't still have thoughts and feelings and emotions, that they still can't fall in love, that they can't enjoy intimacy, that they can't be active, that they can't learn something new, that they're, I think it's just crazy to think that, okay, you turn a certain age and now you're expected to sit in a rocking chair and knit until you die. And it doesn't make sense to me.
It's totally absurd. I mean, there's a lot of things that I could say about the story. I don't want to, criticize things too heavily, but the medical establishment in this country, particularly in regards to, seniors and aging people, but I would say in general, has a long way to go.
Exactly.
And I would add to your list of, all the things that, of course, we have feelings and that sort of thing at any age. But what my father stresses is seniors have incredible potential. He's always talking about developing and starting something new and moving forward. And that's the thing that people don't think, like, oh my God, what incredible potential. When you say that, you immediately think of someone who's young, someone who just
a 20-year-old,
potential to be something great. Somebody who's 75 has incredible potential to take what they've learned in life and do something new, do something exciting, do something innovative. Those are not the kind of things that are associated with aging people in our society. And that's what this book is trying to address.
I agree. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. So your dad brings up the term age casting, which is not something that I had ever heard before. Will you explain what age casting is and how that's different from the ageism that I had heard of?
Sure. Thank you for bringing that up. Very few people have keyed on that when I've been interviewed. It's his coinage, which means that he invented that term.
Okay.
So you would never have heard it unless somebody else independently invented it. It's a type of ageism that has specifically to do with somebody's role in society. Of course, my father was an academic, so tend to think that way. He created it from the term typecasting in entertainment, where somebody plays one role and then they're forced to play that kind of role for the rest of their career.
Exactly.
So it's the exact same thing for senior people. When they become senior, they're cast into this idea that basically that they can't do anything. As you said, they're supposed to sit in a rocking chair. So it's age casted. The age decides what the role that they're supposed to play in society. So it's very similar to ageism, but it's a particular flavor of it, shall we say.
Right.
And he thought it was right. It was really important to cast that off, if you like, and understand that seniors can play any role in society. And I think that is coming to be in the present day. We have a president who's extremely elderly. Just because it's coming to be doesn't mean that people have cast off the prejudices. And that's something that, this book is really trying to address.
Well, something that I've noticed with my own children and then me to my mother, when I was younger, My mother's 20 years older than I am. She was a young mother. So she was 20 years old when she had me. And I remember growing up thinking my mother was old. Right. And then as I got older and recognized my mother was not old then, but still considered she was old now. Well, now I'm 60, my mother's 80, and I don't feel my mother is old anymore.
Right.
In fact, I think she's extraordinarily vibrant, and I love watching her go out and do, etc. But what I've noticed is my children think I'm old.
Right.
And it's interesting how that has happened, because when I was their age, I too thought my mother was old.
Right.
And I keep telling them, because they'll say things to me. My husband and I rode on a tandem bicycle from the coast of Oregon to Washington, D.C.
Wow.
So 3,102 miles. And they, you can't do that, Mom, you're too old. And it was like, yeah, well, watch me. And so there's been a lot of things like that. And so I think it's just interesting how as we ourselves age, as long as we don't fall victim of casting ourselves into a particular role, I'm recognizing that I really don't feel significantly older in my mind. I mean, my body is starting to feel some things, but in my mind, I don't really feel much more than mid-30s tops.
Right.
And I still have lots of things I want to do and achieve and accomplish and be. And the age doesn't seem to be playing a big factor in it anymore. And I wonder at what point, as you're coming along, does that really happen? Like, does it happen when you're 40 or 50? Somewhere in that age, all of a sudden I recognized age is more just a number. And it just represents how many years I've been here, but it doesn't represent what I can and can't do.
Right. Absolutely. I mean, you pretty much summed it up. I could add just one word to that whole process. I think we call that maturity, not in an aging sense, but in an emotional sense.
Right.
You have certain ideas when you're younger, and as you mature, you realize that they're maybe not they don't maybe capture reality as well as you thought they did when you were young. And obviously, we have an incredibly youth-oriented society. That's not the entire reason that your kids think that, but it may be part of it. We have an incredibly youth-oriented society, and young people think the world is about being young, and everything about, being young is great. And when you get older, your, understanding expands, and you realize, well, every age in life has its good points and its bad points.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. In fact, your dad said this, let me see. Old age can be the best time of our life or the worst time of our life. It depends on what we do with it.
Right. Exactly.
And I really liked that, because my thought was, well, that's true really of any age that you live
exactly.
in, like what are you doing with it? And so this idea of, the joyful, living, I know that this is focused on aging, but there are a lot of things throughout that I think that a 30-year-old could read and learn how to be engaged and active in their life at 30 and at 40 and at 50 and at 80 and at 103,
I completely agree with you. I think that my father also had that in mind, because he was used to teaching young people. So this was aimed at seniors, at people who are aging, but he definitely had in his mind how to communicate with people across all ages. And I'm going to drop one thing in about what you said about young people, because a famous poet who my father loved poetry. And as I said, there's poetry sprinkled throughout this book. The famous poet Walt Whitman once said, "Youth is wasted on the young."
Yes.
And it's just so true. If when you're young, you think you understand so much, but as you get a little bit older, you realize that maybe your orientation wasn't particularly correct, and you have some learning to do. And that's just the nature of life. This book could fit anybody at any age, and certainly somebody who's 20 or 25 could get a tremendous amount out of this book that might help them live life, more fulfilled.
More fulfilled, more joyful,
Exactly.
Because the truth is that a lot of these issues your father brought up, with, depression and loss and those things happen throughout our lives.
Exactly.
And we often, especially younger, I think, gloss by them and try to just like live around them and pretend they're not there. And then eventually, by the time you get to be older and have maybe more time and more wisdom to understand it isn't going anywhere and that you need to address it, that's when you start actually like looking at those things. But boy, wouldn't it be really powerful to at 20 years old recognize what you can do to embrace life as it is, and to be able to change into what it's going to become.
Right. Yeah, that's very well put. And as you said, there are actually very specific areas, challenges that, all of us have throughout any age. And my father addresses them and hopefully gives people techniques to move through them and do better. Yes. The one that sticks in my mind is regret, because we all have regret. I think also we have regret at any age. I think as a 20-year-old, you have regrets. As a 30-year-old, and that's something that's hard to deal with. Regret is not a nice feeling, right? No, and my father writes about it and says, maybe try and do this, maybe try and do that. See if this helps you. That one particularly sticks in my mind for somebody of any age, reading that going, wow, that may help me live, more joyously, more creatively.
Right. I agree. I love the fact that your dad told so many stories and examples, because maybe one example didn't touch you, but the next one would. Or maybe the poem didn't touch you, but his example with the woman in the newspaper clipping did, or whatever. And he gives enough examples for each thing that he's talking about, and then asks questions so that you can sit and do the introspection, and then offers like real tangible, here's some things you can try. And he doesn't even say, and when you do this, all your regret will disappear. I mean, he isn't being a Pollyanna about it. He's just saying, regret's going to be there, but there are ways to manage it. And here's some things that you might want to consider trying and see if this works for you. Right. And if not, here's a few more things you might, Exactly. And I really like that approach, which is there isn't a cure-all. And then speaking of cure-all, I love this quote too. He said, aging is not a problem we need to solve, but a stage in life to be lived well.
Right.
And so, his point isn't, okay, so you're getting old and here's how we cure that.
Right.
It's you're aging, and here's how to take everything that you've lived thus far and where you can aim it to keep living joyfully until you're done.
Right.
And you're not done until you're done. I think that as far as what I understood from your father is he expected people to be learning new things and taking new classes right up until they took their last breath.
Exactly. So, just having that attitude of, I can learn and experience new things and incorporate it into my life every day, whether it's a class or whether, it's some everyday experience that you never had before, or some new, minute detail, whatever it is.
Do you think your dad lived that? Did he embrace it? Did you see him living that?
Absolutely. I want to put this in context because it's kind of funny. There's a bunch of different paradoxes, especially from what people know about my father. So I feel like this book and Tuesdays with Morrie are kind of bookends, right? They're two ends of the same spectrum, and there's a lot of paradoxes in it. One of the paradox is that Tuesdays with Morrie was published before this book and is the reason that people know my father, but this book was written first, considerably before Tuesdays with Morrie. Tuesdays with Morrie is considered this beautiful, touching book, but he's discussing all of life and values, but it's about death. My father is dying when the story of Tuesdays with Morrie is told. This book is not about death. People hear like living creatively, aging, and they think, oh, it's not. My father basically doesn't talk about death at all, or very little in this book. This book is about living, joyfully, creatively, continuing to blossom into your as many years as you can. So there's a real continuum between the two books. So for sure, my father, tried his best to answer your question, to live vibrantly, to employ the techniques that he himself was talking about, to learn new things. And he had his own things that, excited him. He says in this book, find out what your interests are, find out what works for you. For some people, that may be studying, that may be going to school, that may be going to a lecture. For my father, it was meeting people and discussing things with them and finding out what their perspective was, what their ideas were. And he continued to do that throughout his life. But to really specifically answer your question, and some people, know this because of Tuesdays with Morrie, he had this tremendous challenge at the end of his life. He had this fatal illness. So it's not all peaches and cream that you sail along, you learn new things. And this was not just like, okay, I have this challenge. This was a real gut punch for him. And he was morose and depressed. And he had to summon all of his resources in order to try and, get above that and live a joyous and vibrant life in the last year of his life. But yes, I think he was successful. And I think it's very clear that he was successful. If you read Tuesdays with Morrie, you can also watch, they're online, the TV segments of Nightline with Ted Koppel, which of course was a huge show, the biggest news magazine show at that time. And you can see, he even talks about the fact that, in the morning he has to get up and make a choice. Like, am I going to rise above this, or am I going to let it drag me down? And there's some mornings, he says, where I grieve and I cry for my situation and etc. But then I make the conscious choice to rise above it. So, he really had a huge challenge in his life. This isn't just theoretical, right? And I think that he was able to rise above it and to live vibrantly until the disease took him.
Right. I think that it's really interesting that when he wrote this book, he was not yet ill. Right. And so in many ways, it was more theoretical. And then in his own life, he had to experience it as essentially, does it really work? Can I really take what I wrote when I felt good?
Right.
And when life was still relatively easy, and the worst thing I was experiencing was a little ageism from a few people, to now I'm ill and it's hard. And, can I still do it? And I think that it's really interesting. The answer is yes, it was written before and maybe more in a theoretical idea, but his life proved that you can and should continue to live in a joyful manner. And there's no reason why you can't, even if you have something like ALS that is going to take your life.
Right. There is a little nuance to what you said. In general, I think that you summarized it very well. In fact, my father had the first sort of like chronic disease of his life.
The asthma. Right.
Around the time. And it was a big deal. It wasn't in the beginning, it was, threatening and it was painful, and they had to get it under control with drugs. And so it wasn't like he was perfectly healthy and this was all theoretical, but it was nothing like ALS, that's for sure. So it was like the little test case, right? Asthma. And, he was able to move beyond that and write this book. The asthma was worse actually before he started writing this book. I think the fact that they got it under control allowed him to have the energy and the strength to write this book.
At that point, it was almost like, so he came through that with shining, and now he wrote the book on how to live joyfully. And then he had to really see, does it really, really work? And I love that it did. So do you have anything else on the horizon for you? What is next for Rob?
Sure. We didn't talk about me so much. Obviously, this project is not really about me. It's about my dad. I'm a journalist and a producer and an entrepreneur. I have two things that I'll talk about because one is very relevant to this discussion, and they're both coming up. So I'm part of a group of producers that's going to make a big benefit music festival for mental health. We feel that there's kind of a mental health crisis in this country and around the world, really. And there's not been enough focus on it. So I'm together with a musical artist and a great producer in LA. We've brought in other producers. The project is called Onetopia, Onetopia. You can go to onetopia.com. We're going to put together a music festival. It's going to be in summer of next year. And hopefully, you know, it will get a lot of attention and we'll be able to raise a lot of money for mental health. You know, mental health was one of the key aspects of my father's career, as I write about in the beginning essay he wrote, and he had a lot of insights about that, where we're actually, you know, standard teaching tools for decades. His book was used as a textbook, his big breakthrough book, which was called The Mental Hospital. So onetopia.com is a big project that I'm working on. Less related to mental health, I also produce film and have worked in the music industry. I'm a partner in a music project to create concerts in virtual reality. So we have a virtual reality platform called Moshpit, Moshpit. The website is Moshpit.live. We haven't launched yet, but we're going to launch in the next few months. And it is related tangentially to what we're talking about here, because we want to offer this virtual platform to musicians who are not famous, to general musicians across the board, because there are other virtual platforms, if you know about this at all, there are other virtual platforms who, you know, whatever, it's Travis Scott doing stuff in virtual. Of course, any virtual company would be, you know, overjoyed to work with a megastar like that, who's going to have massive attention focused on them. And there's a lot of companies out there that are doing that. But we're trying to be the virtual platform for people who don't necessarily have that immediate opportunity.
Right.
So Moshpit will launch in the next couple of months, and I'm really excited about it. We have incredible back end. We have incredible designers. We actually think our environments look better and more realistic than other platforms. But the point is to get it out there, to have people be able to use it and reach their audience. So those are two projects that I'm involved in right now.
Fantastic. Well, good. And is there any other way that you would like people to connect with you besides Onetopia and Moshpit?
Sure. Well, this book has a website, wisdomofmorrie.com. You don't need just wisdomofmorrie.com. I have lots of information about the book up there. You can write to me through that website. I do put one email address out there. Of course, it's not my main email address, but for the public, it's a little bit of a strange word, so I can spell it out for you. GANGAMATI, Gangamati @yahoo.com. Gangamati is a river goddess in India. They call the river that we call Ganges, the famous river, is called Ganga in India. So Gangamati basically means mother of the Ganges. And I use that email address. People are, you know, perfectly welcome to write to me. I love to hear from people. I love to hear their reactions to this book, and hopefully it helps. If the book helps you, if you're, you know, in any way find the book valuable, please write a review. It's so important to write reviews, especially if you like the book, on Amazon, on Goodreads, on Barnes and Noble website, whatever website you use for literature. I'm sure you're very familiar with it since you're an author.
Yes, having the reviews, it's amazing what that does to help people start to learn who you are and what you're doing and what the book is doing. And so
and
I agree.
I have to give a shout out to Mitch Albom, because none of this would be possible without Mitch. His book is so beautiful. You know, it's a very concise book. He uses his words so perfectly. There's not one wasted word in the whole book. And, you know, for a new generation, if you haven't read Tuesdays with Morrie, you know, you can get it, and you may be surprised at how beautifully Mitch writes and how wonderfully he captures my father. And if you crack it open, you'll understand why it was #1 on the bestseller list for 5 consecutive years
Wow.
in the early 2000s.
I saw
Well,
that actually as a play.
I can tell you a lot about that. There's a lot of fascinating information. He wrote a play, he opened as an off-Broadway play, and somehow, in addition to the book has been, Tuesdays with Morrie has been translated into like 40 languages. The Wisdom of Morrie also, I have about 12 or 13 different languages, so I'm very happy about that. But Tuesdays with Morrie has been about 40 different languages, and somehow the play has permeated the world, and I have done Q&A after the play in all sorts of different cultures, including Japan, where I lived for a long time, and China, mainland China. The play is incredibly popular, performed at the most prestigious theaters in Beijing, in Shanghai, with super famous Chinese actors, and it's just remarkable how the popularity of the play in China. So, his dad's message really sort of reaches across cultures and age groups. So
it does.
I'm so happy about that. Yeah.
It's wonderful.
Of course, I want people to get the Wisdom of Morrie and experience it for themselves. Maybe we'll leave this with a teaser, because I alluded to it. There are, and I'm sure you're aware of it, there are specific techniques in this book on how to live more creatively and more vibrantly. And some of them may speak to you and some of them may not. Some of them are very personal that you do by yourself. Particularly, I'll just drop one in there, particularly meditation. My father was really interested in meditation, practiced it. It doesn't have to be connected to any spiritual path or any dogma or anything like that. It's purely a mind technique to calm yourself down, to focus your mind. And that's one technique. There's a lot of other suggestions and techniques like that, some of which really reach across all age groups. Like meditation is good for everybody.
For everyone.
Other ones are a little bit more focused on aging people, but I would encourage people to get the book, if just for that, to learn the techniques that my father is putting out there to try and help you live a more full and creative life, more joyous.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for being with me today, Rob. I really enjoyed chatting with you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Visibility Pod, for all your services and management of our podcast.